Just if somebody can confirm that sound is okay. Someone was a bit concerned. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, so I start.
I can make
Actually,
a
you should make the introduction.
small introduction, exactly. So welcome everybody to this third ARIGA session with Marinos Koutsomichalis. Marinos is an artist, a scholar, and a creative technologist. He is broadly interested in the materiality of self-generative systems, post-digital objecthood, sound, image, data, electronic circuitry, perception, selfhood, and the media technologies we rely upon to mediate, probe, interact, or otherwise engage with the former. He is currently a lecturer in creative multimedia at the Cyprus University of Technology in Limassol, where he also co-directs the Media Arts and Design Research Lab, which you can find at the medlab.cool address in the network. So now we'll leave the stage to Marinos and his talk on generative systems employing natural language.
Thanks, David. So essentially, my talk is about 3 different projects where I intend to demonstrate through example how I use natural languages on a few different creative occasions. The first one is a project called Objective Easering. I think this is from 2017 or 18. So it was back when I used to work in Norway, in Trondheim, as a postdoc researcher. So essentially, this is a pipeline that I have designed that translates, not translate, maybe it's the wrong word, transliterates from text to 3D objects, which then I can 3D print. So I arrive in the situation where we have text and we end up with some physical artifact like the one you see now. I'll talk a little bit about the technical background of the project and how it aesthetically manifests. But before that, I guess that it's always, for all those attending here today, at least in Zoom, I think it's already explicit. But in other contexts, it's not necessarily explicit. So I need to straighten this out straight away that this is not a project about representing text through objects. Essentially, it's an experimental endeavor, and what I'm hopefully trying to achieve is an exploration of the technological infrastructures that I rely upon to have this project implemented. So there is this kind of self-introspection that's very central to my overall practice. I do that a lot. For me, self-generative systems and generally what I do in my own artistic work is always about pointing back to the very same materials and the media that I use. So I don't want this to be transparent, and all the media and the materials that appear in there are always an excuse to kind of interrogate their very nature, their function, their own materiality, and so on. So in this case, I guess that what is of primary interest is to how to arrive at objects that are weird, experimental, and that point back to their own making. And I'll come back to this point. It's quite interesting because this is one of those projects that exist, at least for me, exactly because the technologies that I use to make it happen are yet far from perfect. So you get all this kind of glitches and this kind of situations. I will come back through example in a little while about this, but this is what makes this project interesting in the first place. So this is just to set it clear from the beginning that this is not about a functional solution to the problem of how to go from text to an object or anything like that, rather the opposite. So in a nutshell, this is the pipeline has 2 parts, the transliteration part, where I start from an input text and I end up with a bag of 3D models. And then the synthesis part comes after that, which is how I move from this bag of models to a physical artifact. This is pretty standard natural language processing. I don't want, and today generally in all the three examples that I'm about to discuss, I won't get that much into low-level technical affairs. I'm more interested in presenting the concepts and the implementation from an artistic point of view. Artistic research is the focus here. So all this is pretty much standard NLP, natural language processing thing. So I start with an input text. This is tokenized. I create I tag the individual tokens, the words. I rely in either ConceptNet or WordNet to find a list of similar words for each of the words that appear originally in the text. And anyhow, the whole point is to arrive at a situation where the input text boils down to a set of the most important keywords. In reality, key concepts, not keywords, because some of these concepts may not appear in the original text, but there are synonyms. So I rely on ConceptNet or WordNet to make sure that when I have a situation, like for instance, imagine that in the original text you have a reference to network, another reference to internet, another reference to the World Wide Web. So essentially all these three terms, they are different words, but they're kind of related. So what I try to do is to make sure that the system understands that they are related and that they somehow become more accelerated in the list of the eventual keywords. So essentially the point here is to condense the input text to just a few words that ideally represent and sum up the gist of the input text. And this is already a point of interest because I guess all these systems, they come up with their own signatures. So there is already an element of exploring how algorithms understand the input text and what they think it's important to maintain and what to lose. The next stage, I come back with, for each of those, are still here now, for each of those keywords, the algorithm performs keyword queries in the Thingiverse and downloads the models that Thingiverse has to offer for those keywords. If there are more than one keyword, it will just randomly select one. If there are no keywords, it might try another keyword. So you arrive at the bag of models, and then you have the synthesis pipeline. So this is more straightforward. I just get some info about all these models, and they are essentially scattered around. They are, they move around in space. I might have them automatically change their dimension. If there are problems, they are automatically repaired, scaled, translated, rotated, and then they're merged so that the output model is essentially a synthesis of this bag of models that the algorithm thinks that best represents the input text in its essence. So to give you an example, this is the three laws of robotics of Isaac Asimov. And this is where you get the kind of glitches I mentioned in the beginning. So you see, for example, that this pipeline understands law as a cell phone, an iPhone case. It's, I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's here. Okay. Or protection is this, human is this. So I think it becomes an important element. We are fumbling, the whole project fumbles around this situation where the technologies at this particular time, they understand that law somehow relates to this, which of course is very influenced by the kinds of models users upload in Thingiverse. A very important concept that also stays for the second project I'm about to talk about later on. A few more And this is the final object. 3D printing. I find it very interesting how you start with a text, then you go on with algorithms that kind of misinterpret the text in their own ways. This also goes through user-generated content repositories, so that the algorithm's understanding also has to do with the kind of subcultures that are involved in the making of this particular repository. So of course you have lots of people from hacking making culture, or a few engineers maybe, and some people who are into coding and technology that upload models that are specific to their cultures. So this is also reflected in the kind of models that the algorithm downloads. And then you have all this kind of, let's say, creative noise. And you have the text go through this kind of processes. And then you end up with something that it's a question really. Is it reminiscent somehow of something that is even remotely related to the original text? This is not the motor behind the project anyhow, but I have performed it with some small scale experiments to, asking people what they think about all these objects and so on. I haven't included them in my presentation, but it's also interesting on its own sake. A different example. This is then here, the input text is a several paragraphs long excerpt from the sci-fi novel Diaspora by Greg Egan. I suggest that you have a read in this book, by the way. It's a very interesting one. It's one of my favorite books written the last 30 years or so. Anyhow, it's a long text. It's a few pages long. It describes the process of organogenesis. This book is in the far, far future where there are actually not much humans left, the way I understand them today, but the world is mostly run from software, sentient software entities. So you have this process where a non-sentient piece of software gives birth to a new software-based life form by using some previously unused seeds, like informational seed, which is, let's say, the equivalent of DNA. So here you can see that the algorithm interprets ancient, like this mechanical piece, junctions, a few more models here. The system is parameterizable, so I can select how many objects to how many keywords the pipeline should end up with. So I can play a little with the density. And this is the final object. By the way, I tried different colors. I have this in pink as well. Different materials, different sizes. This is from Thoreau, early American philosopher. So you see that somehow ended up with a mask of Iron Man over there, and with the doctor's Dr. Something's door sign. Okay, that the algorithm somehow sees as relevant to this. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. A stereotype but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of mankind. But still, it's not random at all. So you still see a human figure in there. And I guess this is what that fascinates me in these particular projects and why I decided to go on with experiments. You are in this in-between situation where some things make some sense, but not all of them. And this opens up the door to a genuine exploration of the materiality of the media and the algorithms involved. So changing a few things in the algorithm in there, and you end up with very different exams. I only have a few more photos of objects I have created this way. I have created a lot of objects actually. This is from it's from a news article about casino capitalism or something like that. This is from another novel of Isaac Asimov. It's a small fragment talking about time travel. I don't remember what this is. I have to look in my archive. Neither this. I have also this next to me, which is in blue. And there are a few more. I have made like lots of objects in reality. So this is an example of how you start with natural language, and you end up with I kind of use natural language as the medium that flows in between the parts of the system in a creative process to generate, in this case, objects. The next project is a step up in several ways. For starters, here the output is truly multimedia. So this thing I called hyperstation bot. I won't go into why it is made of concrete and steel and why it looks like this. This is part of a different talk. At this point, I will only say that I'm very interested in weird, dysfunctional, critical, experimental interfaces as well. So this is kind of reflected there, even if this is a rather idiosyncratic case. Inside this block of concrete, there is an ecosystem of 4 microcomputers interconnected with one another in a local network. Each having a kind of different role in there. And the whole project, this bot is capable of generating text through the thermal printer you see on top. There is a small thermal printer. Text, audio, several channels of video that I also use for image. I also plan to attach some synthesizer so that it can also generate 3D objects. Essentially, it's the same algorithm as the one that I explained in the previous example with some modifications. I think that's it. And overall, it draws on this idea of hyperstation. Hyperstation relates with the theories of philosopher Nick Land and the work that they did in the cybernetic culture research unit back in the 90s. So I have 2 different definitions in here. One is narratives able to effectuate their own reality through the workings of feedback loops, generating new sociopolitical attractors. And the other is ideas that function causally to bring about their own reality, transmuting fictions into truths. Essentially, the concept of hyperstation links to the theories of Dawkins about memes and so to say a view of the world which is much into genealogy. So the idea is that you have things and ideas that they are able to bring about their own realities. This stands in contrast with an ecosystemic view of reality, where it's the environments that kind of shape realities, functional or functional worlds and so on. This is a very interesting opposition for me. We can also see this and discuss about this, with respect to humans, whether how important is DNA, and this understanding of humans with respect to their genotypes, in opposition to an ecosystemic view of the humans as creatures that are shaped by their environment, physical, cultural, or otherwise. I think this is a very important, a very interesting opposition that I wish to explore in various ways. So here I focus on this notion that ideas are indeed able, up to some certain extent, to bring about their own reality, which of course I don't say that it happens. It's just the working hypothesis behind this machine. So I have decided this bot, not robot, I apologize, which sees a complex ecosystemic evolutionary pipeline for multimedia synthesis. It is connected in the World Wide Web. It retrieves content from the World Wide Web. So essentially it downloads multimedia content in a fashion that ever renovates the content using the ideas and the fictional things that are there. I will explain how it's done in a little bit. And it uses that to synthesize new multimedia content. So the idea is that this machine somehow fumbles about the hypothesis of non-human creativity, non-human in the sense that even if I designed it, there are no criteria in there about how this material should be used. So what I try, and I underscore this try, I don't say that I have managed to do it. I just say that what is the driving force and the main idea. What I try to do here is to have a machine that explores the internet, or to be more precise, the human culture as represented in the internet through the media contents that we humans decide to share with others in repositories in the World Wide Web. So you have a machine that relies upon this content. It explores it, it interrogates our culture, and tries to recombine and to assemble something new out of it. Well, yeah, this is the only installation of the piece until now. It's mostly video and text in this case. We opted not to use sound because of problems specific with this particular installation. But this is how the thing looks like when in action. Okay, so you have the block here, a few screens, and text generation. An example of the kind of text it generates. Pretty machinic, I'd say. Okay, so I mean, technically speaking, this is a very complicated setup. The building block is this system of mind that I call the evolutionary media repositories. Now, for most of the people into generative system, evolution stands for using fitness functions of some sort. This is not the case here. This is rather an algorithm which is based, it's of an ecosystemic nature. So it goes like this. I start with a seed. The seed is any word in any language. As far as I remember, for the first incarnation of the hybrid system board, I use the word evolution, but sometimes I use the word transcendence as well. So I start with a word. This is the first genome. Genomes are natural language graphs. They are weighted graphs. So you essentially have tokens of natural language in any kind of language, as long as it can be representable with the ACII character set. So not the ACII, the Unicode. As long as it's representable in Unicode, it's perfectly valid. So I have graphs. The graphs hold natural language token with a weight and with a set of interconnections between the different word tokens in there. Then there is a set of modular attachable crawlers. So I have crawlers to say for YouTube, crawlers for Wikipedia, crawlers for free sound, crawler modules. These modules rely on these graphs to start perform queries. They start with the natural language token, which is the most, I mean, obviously in the first iteration, they start with a seed. Okay, but as the process goes on, the genome is updated. So they start first with a seed, then they follow the chain of connected natural language tokens, and they download multimedia content. They don't only download multimedia content, they also download metadata. So for instance, from YouTube, I download videos, but I also download user comments, descriptions, and so on. These are passed to comprehenders. This dust arrow in the middle is the metadata. The phenotype is the resulting multimedia that have been downloaded from the internet. And the comprehenders again, there are a few comprehending modules. At the current implementation, I have a metadata comprehender that, a keyword comprehender that comprehends like tags, keywords, a comprehender to analyze text. So it takes like huge pieces of text and tries to extract the most important phrases out of them. And I have also a comprehender for images so that it can take images and tries through computer vision to understand what kind of things are there in the image. So all these comprehenders, they produce new natural language descriptors. And these are the next iteration, the genome of the next iteration. So this is the cycle essentially. You start with a word, then the machine crawls the internet, it downloads content, tries to make sense of this content through AI and machine understanding. It generates new language tokens out of them. Again, it's very important to underscore here that it also analyzes user comments, human descriptions, and so on. In this way, we arrive at a new genomic representation, and the circle goes on and on. In the meanwhile, the phenotype can be used by synthesizers to generate multimedia outputs. This is an example of a graph. So this is how genomic tokens look like. You see already there are things in a few languages in here. Actually, this is just the second iteration. First iteration here is Nirvana, the word Nirvana. So after just one iteration, we end up with this: Promised Land, Eden, Sangri Paradise, some words in, this is an Indian language, I think it's Bengali or something. Sorry, not Bengali, it's Tamil. And all this, they are connected. So these connections represent possible relationships. This is something that comes out of the comprehenders. And the idea is that then the crawlers will start with the highest ranked word. And if they can't find results about this word, they will just follow these connections to use similar terms. Some of the media that are downloaded, again, this is first iteration Nirvana. And this is where it already gets interesting, that you start with the word in Nirvana and you trust a machine to crawl the network to achieve an exploration of the human culture in machinic terms. And after a few iterations, you end up with things that relate with the Nirvana, the rock group. Some things that relate with trains, have no idea why. Lots of images of trains. And videos that have to do with trains, with video clips by Nirvana, and with also things that relate with Buddhism, because Nirvana is also a concept of Buddhism. After a little while, so this is third iteration using the word transcendence, it gets really crazy. Fourth iteration, it's no longer something that it's meaningful for us human. But the point here is that, and this actually is the kind of graphs you get in real life use, because in an installation setup, I want to make sure that I don't have the machine exhausting out possible situations. So again, there are a lot of parameters to work out here, but the idea is that you want something that you plug in the internet, that it will keep exploring the internet, downloading new contact, and following code chain resolution patterns forever. So that kind of graphs are very interesting, because it will typically you only get a few replies from the first few queries, but if you don't, there is a vast space to explore. Again, many languages appear here. This is important. You start with English or another word, but after a while, you just explore the internet. The algorithm will analyze user comments or meta tags, and this will lead to cultural complexities that relate with, for instance, it could be that a certain group is very famous in another country, so you also get comments in this other language. Here you see the entire process in a different graph. So the genotype is used by the crawlers. I have crawlers for all these things and also for a few others. The understanding pattern is used to create the new genotype, but the multimedia output is used by the synthesizers. I have video synthesizers, audio synthesizers, text, 3D data. The text synthesizer is a machine learning pipeline that is trained using lyrics. I use lyrics from, there's a lyrics database, and also from Wikipedia, text from Wikipedia. So that the text is essentially, it's this process where you have this neural network and you train it, it produces some text, and then you train it again on top of that. So it's trained to produce text that is similar to this input it has received, but the input changes over time, so the output also changes over time. So to sum up with a hyperstition bot, this is a rather complicated system technically, but the idea is quite specific. I want to achieve an exploration of user-generated content repositories, and I believe that to some certain extent they reflect and they do account for human culture in its current trans-geographical and trans-sociopolitical contingency. So I use a machine to explore the space, hopefully in a way which is very specific to machines. So there is no fitness function, there is no criteria there on how it should select things or not. There are just algorithms that are meant to comprehend their own way the results of this exploration. They download media, they analyze this media, and the circle goes on and on until forever, actually. Hopefully, this process and the generated material will be hyperstitional in nature. That is, that it would somehow account for new kinds of realities that have emerged out of ideas, fictions, and speculations and real content found on the internet. So overall, this endeavor is it's one of my most recent experiments in how to arrive at some kind of self-generative system that does not at all tries to imitate human creativity, but rather tries to arrive at some kind of computational and non-human take on multimedia synthesis. Third and final project is a joint collaboration with Alexia Hileos. This is called Cyprus as AI Saw It, Reinventing the Colonial Gaze. So the starting point in this project is the fact that the algorithms upon which we invest a lot more of our everyday life, essentially, like using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Companies rely more and more on using AI to make decisions. So the fact is that all these algorithms prove themselves rather racist sometimes, rather sexist, and also of things that are generally considered unwanted. So here I have a few of the recent situations that are embarrassing for the companies, and they're alarming to the extent that we can certainly talk about digital colonialism as a very topical situation. I have a few papers on the top left of my presentation, of the bottom left. This is well articulated in a number of scientific papers and even books these days. To some alarming extent, there are evidence that present-day technologies somehow quite often behave in ways that accelerate hierarchies, sustain or impose social divisions, are often discriminatory about certain groups of individuals, and so on. So overall, this situation we refer to with the term digital colonialism. The vast majority of existent AI and text-to-image pipelines specifically are not meant, and in fact, mostly most often fail to generate images that account for non-Western landscapes or for ones related with other culture. This is something that Alexia realized when working on a project of hers. So essentially, she was using text-to-image pipelines to generate images from text. And then she took text from, for instance, this book, Cyprus as I Saw It in 1879. It's a typical colonial era handbook about Cyprus. So she took text from this book. Actually, in reality, that came a little bit after. So first thing that happened is that she took like text that is essentially descriptions of landscapes that are landscapes and also advertisements from real estate agencies that relate with Cyprus and the general region, and she fed it through a pipeline, a text-to-image pipeline that is well documented to perform well. But the resulting images, they were not at all reminiscent of the local landscape. So next step is, okay, so what if I try to experiment a little bit with this idea? How can we arrive at a system that is somehow aware of the local reality? So next step was that she used the text from this book and books of sort, and she tried to create her own database using photos that are specific to the location, or at least that look like more close to this particular reality, which is Cyprus and the Middle Eastern landscape and the East Mediterranean landscape, call it whatever. So, for instance, here we get a resulting image. On the left, you can see the intermediate stages. And then you can see the same kind of text. What you get when it's done using the COCO dataset, which is a standard dataset used for text-to-image synthesis and for image synthesis in general. I think it's by Microsoft. And here on the right, you see what you get when we use our own custom dataset. Of course, a DIY dataset is a huge project, and it's not an effort that is supposed to be benchmarked or anything. But this is the first critical take of Alexia on this project. How can we come up with our own dataset and our own pipeline, hopefully, that reflects the local reality? How can we claim more space for off-center realities, for non-Western realities, for languages other than English, for landscapes and cities that doesn't look like the American ones or the French one? How can we claim more space about all these things in contemporary AI research? So the solution we came up with is this project that we try to use our own data sets. And this is where my part also comes in. Then we extended this project with the idea of involving language as well. So for instance, here, this is experts from the book of Baker, Cyprus as I Saw It in 1879. And you get on the right, the results from our custom dataset, and on the left, what you would get with COCO. Evidently, even if very abstract, you can see that the image on the right is more reminiscent of Eastern Mediterranean in many respects than it is the one on the left. A few more examples here. Yeah, of course, you can expect that you can imagine that the original handbook is full of, it's a very colonialist view of Cyprus. It's, a colonizer describing ways to exploit their newly annexed land. So the idea is that, okay, what if we train a system using colonial handbook of Cyprus so that the system also generates the input text for the text-to-image synthesizer? I apologize for this diagram. It's a last-minute thing, but it gives you the idea. And of course, it didn't start as an idea. We experimented a lot, and then we arrived at the situation that we think and we have a system that makes a lot of sense to us. So we have this text generator. It's trained on Colonial Handbook of Cyprus, and essentially it produces machine-style colonial views of Cyprus on demand. Okay, so you ask the system to produce something, and you get a new colonialist piece of text, and that's it. And it's trained on the huge, like 5 or 6 different style handbooks, colonial handbooks of the 19th century. We also have the original text-to-image synthesizer. This is a well-known system. We modified it only slightly. It does perform well, but we have created a new, we call it the colonial dataset. So it's a new dataset with different sets of images and tags and labels, so that we have trained it according to this dataset. And we use the text generated by the colonial text generator to generate images that also relate and somehow originate, in this case, not on the original text, but on this new neo-colonial view of the place. The output we use for in a number of artifacts. So I have made a book, there is an installation, there is an app. This is how the installation looks like. An exposition of, this is a recent installation, it's a couple of months old, in Ukraine, the Dramatica Festival in Lvov. So you see in the wall there are a few text excerpts and a few images. All we understand as colonial gazes of the island. Some example text. It's contingent, so essentially we can ask the system to produce an infinite number of text snippets that are reminiscent of a 19th century colonialist view of the island. Examples of generated imagery. And now when it comes to how to present materials of sort, which you probably notice that the people who are doing generative art are probably well aware of this themselves. How do you present these results to a living audience? This is a procedural piece, so it's not about the generated images, it's about this whole endeavor as a practice that it intends to be critical, intends to be creatively, intends to speculate about the possibility of a non-solutionist, non-Western-centric, different and more critical use of AI technologies. So how do you present this as a process? We came up with a few solutions to this. This is a video of the installation. You see that there is this table where we have some expositions aside the printed, the wall. This table has essentially 3 supported elements. I mean, there are other ways to present the work, but essentially in this table we also have them collected together. So there is the book, there is information of how to download and install the smartphone applications, and there is a few small craft envelopes that we encourage audience to take a few colonial views of the island with them as memorabilia of the overall project. And of course, we have a small subset of the books that we use to train the algorithm. So this is supportive of the system. And it somehow closes a circle. We start with the colonial handbooks of the 19th century. We use contemporary technology to explore their materiality by means of a new system that generates context and imagery that are supposedly, and up to a certain extent, they are indeed reminiscent of this colonialist view of this location. But in the meanwhile, we have incorporated new technologies. And then we use them to assemble a new book that features generated text, generated imagery. People can shuffle it around, so it's essentially, there is no particular ordering there. There is this application that we have created. You can download it actually, just look for Cyprus as AI, so it's available in the App Store and in the Android Studio, in the Play Store, I apologize. And you can just tap on the screen and you get a new contingent colonial gaze of the island. Sometimes you only get text, sometimes you get an imagery and the text that was used to generate this imagery. We intend to extend this project in the future. And the final aspect of the installation is that we have a collection of printed matter, images, small photos, and small text prints, and to encourage audiences to take them with them so that somehow this physical tactile quality is also stimulated. So thank you for your patience. Hopefully you found some interesting aspects in there and we can stay a little bit around and discuss matters. Just to say that I decided to focus more on aesthetics and intentions and how I understand all these projects from a more artistic point of view. But of course, there is lots of technical affairs in there that if you wish, we can further discuss. I know that you might have questions of sort, about how these particular things happens and why and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Marinos, for your presentation. It's very dense projects that you have presented us, and very interesting one. Are there any questions from anybody?
Or comments, maybe criticism, whatever. Yeah.
Nobody? Well, maybe I just comment from myself. It was the project in which we worked together, Gerhard and mine. At a certain point, Gerhard and me, at a certain point we stumbled across or were thinking about the term complexification or complication in some sense, and as a method or as a methodology to which one can follow in doing this kind of generative works. And I mean, it came into my mind looking at or trying to understand the aggregates that you are designing. And it's a highly complex machines or aggregates of different already very complex machines. And I at a certain point there is a moment in which the starting condition or the starting point where the process starts really it somehow loses its meaning, and the whole and just the outputs basically are there, whatever the outputs whatever you might call the outputs, but the images in your sense or the 3D prints. I mean, these may stand by themselves at a certain point, and I still wondering if, I mean, I understand that all your projects start from by a very solid or a very thorough conceptual ground, and then all this processes try to follow this and realize something that is somewhere else, so to say, in the concept or in the conception of the work. But at a certain point, this work start to begin their own, to develop their own materiality. And this is, I mean, I'm still trying to understand that if the complexification or complexity or complication of these machines contributes to this, and where, at what threshold of complexity or complexification this happens. I think that's a very interesting moment. I don't know if you have some.
Yes, I have lots of comments in this. I will start with the fact that you're right to the point. I mean, this is very important for me and to how I work in general. As you correctly pointed out, I usually, not always, but generally, I start with some kind of rigid conceptual something, an idea or something. But this is, I guess, the weird thing with me. I don't believe in concepts and ideas that much. So for me, what is really important and really interesting is to arrive at this situation that you very well described, where complexity brings its own something. So this is the true exploration for me. I'm not interested in creating systems that I control. I'm not interested in creating systems that they serve an idea or that they serve a role on their facts, not at all. I typically start with an idea or a concept or something just because you have to start from something. I'm a human, you know, I can't. As a matter of fact, I sometimes do start from materials. It does happen, but this process, it is not that important anyhow. I mean, even when I start with ideas, in reality, when I try to create the actual project, then I will let the materials guide me, and I will certainly hybridize things. I will take very eclectic decisions. I will try to raise the complexity and the amount of remediation there in all sorts of possible ways to arrive at a situation where the system and the project is operating on its own, and that I become the one who serves the system. So there, I'm not trying to prove a concept correct. This is there in all projects. In the case of the first project, for instance, in objective visoring, as I pointed out, I'm not interested in arriving at a system that truthfully creates a physical representation of the input text. I'm not at all interested in that. This is kind of rather an excuse of arrival at the system. This is not the goal. This is what I'm trying to achieve, to create a system that would surprise me, that would create weird things. And then that I would look at this and say, okay, but how this has ever happened? And of course, this is a situation of emergent complexity. I start with this idea, what happens if you do this? And in the process, of course, I know in all these years that I'm doing projects of sort that there is nothing that works the way it should. This we can take for granted. You know? There is no transparent material or medium on process out there. I know this for sure. So it's a question of emphasizing these shortcomings of the systems, these differences, whatever you find. So when I realized that thinking versus you and thinking versus you ask for love, and you get like an iPhone case, this is a very interesting way to bring about this complexity. Because then suddenly the cultural specificities and the subcultural orientation of the people who use thinking versus and of the way this very particular repository works will be also become part of the system. And not just that, also on a technical level, the search algorithm, you know, the search algorithm, the query algorithm that is used by either ConceptNet or WordNet or Thingiverse. It's interesting also this, that ConceptNet and WordNet, they have very different behavior. ConceptNet will typically arrive with much further, with connections, you know, and relationships that are a bit further apart than WordNet. Now, in the case of the hyperstation bot, this is even more prominent. And you can also see it in the material. This is something that doesn't have to do a lot with generative algorithms, but it's quite indicative. I could do all this with a laptop. Really, I mean, I could have all the algorithms running in a laptop, but I didn't do it this way. You know, I took like 4 microcomputers, each communicated with the other through complicated network processes. So then I had to also account for the fact that, okay, I have this evolutionary media repository system in one microcomputer. It downloads the media content, and then it has to send and distribute this content to the other microcomputers. So how does it know if they have arrived? And what happens, you know, after some time that the hard drive will be full? So there has to be also a cleaning mechanism and some kind of infra communication. And why put all this, you know, in a concrete block? And especially, you know, with this aluminum, it's not aluminum, sorry, it's steel, chicken wire, which is kind of very dangerous. I mean, this thing, it's very heavy, and it's kind of meant up to a certain logical extent, it will also injure you. If you, most of the people who have tried to touch this will get away with small cuts because it's rough hewn, and it's meant to be like that. And this, from my point of view, is how I deal with that sort of things. You know, I start with a concept which is hyperstationary in this case, but then it evolves. It's no longer about the concept. It's about how to further hybridize, how to further induce complexity, so you arrive at a situation that you have a thing that does much more than what I had in mind. And this is where I become myself part of this. And I kind of try to figure out what is the potential of the system, so that I serve this potential of the system. It might be not that evident in the final project with Alexia, but if you think that this was originally Alexia's research, and then I just try to be an observer there and to understand how it can be further hybridized and further, you know, raise the complexity of the thing, it's more evident. So that was my role, kind of to push this in new directions and see what happens. And then, of course, because it's not just about algorithms, it's also about ways to present the processes, ways to present the result in outputs, how you put them in the wall, you know, how you print it out, the imagery. But we also did an iPhone app and the Android app. We could as well have a screen. So all these questions are also ways to further hybridize and to introduce more complexity in a project. I think this is very important when we deal with generative art, because algorithms, they do things, they generate media, and the ways that we present this media to living audiences or to other machines as well are equally important with the processes that have created. So I try to make that part of the project as well.
Thank you. Maybe there are other questions? Ludwig?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the last part you were talking about there, how in one sense you are sort of reacting to the surprise of the generative output of these systems, and that is sort of one relationship with the material. But on the other hand, you have the very careful authored design approach of creating these stagings of the outputs. Or how do you see those two approaches?
Well, it's a bit misleading. I don't have this carefully authored approach.
Okay.
It looks like that because this is how I present it afterwards. In reality, it's not like that. It's that I start with an idea, then I just throw it, you know, it's very dirty actually. I just throw the idea, you know, in the algorithm, see what happens, and then I kind of make lots of changes. I experiment a lot.
No, but I meant the sort of installation, like the stagings of the results seem to follow a sort of perhaps a little bit of a different logic than your exploration of the original material. Or
yeah, I'm not sure if they follow a different logic or not, but to give you some perspective on this, I'm a very processual person, you know, and all the projects I do, they somehow inform one another, and I do lots of things. I also do, I mean, it's, you normally, I grew up having this ideal, that artists are very good in one thing and that I should focus on this one thing, and become better and better and better. But after 20 years, I realized that I'm not like that. And I can't do that. I have many interests. And the thing is that all these interests somehow overlap, but in ways that are probably very specific to myself alone. So I also do other projects that have to do with landscapes. I go out in the field, I record sounds, take videos. I do like things like, poetry and sound art, not necessarily related with algorithms. But for me, there is a deeply rooted procedural and processual nature in all this. So one of the long-lasting themes in my approach over the last at least 15 years is the question of the space, the question of the audience, and the question of also hybridizing ways to perform art. So if you see it with respect to this, so to give you another example, there is this other world of mine. I have it here actually, accidentally. So yeah, there is this thing. Okay, that's a very different project. It's about EEG, so you wear it and you have algorithmic sound produced with respect to EEG activity, and there is also an AI module in there and so on. But the thing is, why I mentioned this, how do I present this? So I worked out a lot with this question back in this project, and I arrived at this situation that there is a very complicated format. So it's an installation with the final headset, and also with the materials that I used in creating the headset, and some video that tells the story of this situation, which is extended through a series of workshops. So I invite local audiences and I facilitate the workshops and help them to create their own headsets that should be about their own ideas, though, not mine. So they are specialized and individuated somehow. And then these become part of the installation, and they exhibit them next to mine. And there is also, a web platform that we take all this knowledge somehow and we open source it and we share it with the world, and we invite people to contribute more stuff. So this situation where we somehow try to merge like performance with installation, with education, with workshopping, with a participatory do it with others approach. This is something that it's core to my practice in many respects. Sometimes it's more about this, some other times it's less about that. So in this particular situation, when I tend to think in terms of projects. So for me, a project is a set of materials, a set of algorithms, a set of ways to approach the algorithms of the materials. There is no end in this. I just lay them in the table. I typically start with some conceptual something that I try to explore. After a little while, I introduce complexity there, so it might no longer be that much relevant. And then comes the question of how present not the final output, not the video or the images or the text that was produced by Hyperstition bot, but how present this whole project. The fact that I wanted and I started exploring Hyperstition, but then I ended up with something different, which also has concrete and still in there. How do you present this? And how do you present this always unfinished spirit that is somehow, it's one of my values. I mean, you don't have to finish. So in this certain case, what we had in front of us is a system that generates text of a colonial nature the way that we see it. I mean, that was the concept in the very end. Okay, so we start with training a neural network with that kind of material, and ideally you arrive at a system that produces material which is reminiscent of this kind. It happened. And we already had Alexia's work on how to translate this material into imagery, which is very typical of what you may expect of GAN-generated imagery. And it also relates with the project, and to have this database of hairs that we've tried to expand and populate. So how do you present this to a living audience? But not in terms of just the final outcome, because they're not the most important part in there. But this whole spirit of exploration, this whole problematic, that we are trying to arrive at a DIY AI conceptualization, that we try, react to the fact that we should use, a database which is very good and big and, can aid us realize interesting images. No, we say we will have our own data set. We will engage a little bit with the algorithm. We will try to do it differently, to fumble about the possibility of a very localized, imperfect, problematic, yet critical system. And then, of course, all this background of mine, working with workshops, working with participatory methods and so on, it's in my head. And I try to seek solutions to this question of how to present with respect to all this material. Complex and hybridization is there. The smartphone applications are not that much to support the installation. It's more to give the people that can't attend the installation an alternative way to access this project. But for the people who went in the installation, they can also function as a reminder of their experience there. And of course, in a different exhibition, we will set the whole thing slightly differently. And so on. The book is probably there to just emphasize the conceptual nature of the project. So it starts with a book, it finishes with a book. And this becomes an art object. This is more or less, I don't know if I satisfy the question, but this is kind of how I think. You could say that I try to avoid having a final outcome. So I always think of ways to make the presentation more complex and more distributed and more fragmented, maybe.
No, I think you very well illustrate the challenges of trying to sort of exhibit process.
Yeah, I don't say that I succeed. Oh yeah, I have to. It's interesting because what comes out of it is that, for me, a challenge is to also avoid doing the same thing all the time, because then it becomes a signature style, which is not bad. Okay, and of course you have to. I want to go back to the same themes again and again over my life, to further refine them, to understand them better, to see them from different eyes. But I don't want things, to become kind of like very manneristic, so that, okay, I have this project, I do an installation, I do a workshop, I do this. This is also kind of doesn't respect the materials, so to say. So it also depends on the process and the materials.
Thanks.
Sometimes it doesn't work the way I want it, though. I have to say that. It's kind of, it's a very experimental and questionable method, certainly.
Any other questions? Okay, then I think I can thank you again, Marinos, for your presentation. Thank you very much. It would be great, I think, if you could share a little bit of all these materials, all these photos and images, also on the research catalog with us. I think it would be a great material to look at, and a little bit more with more time, having more time at our disposal. And yeah, other than that, again, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here, and see you, I believe, next week with the presentation by Kaspar, if I remember well. And
thanks everybody for
Thank you.
attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Looking
Bye.
forward next week.
Yep.
Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.
David? Probably you would need a text